When Daniel finally stood in the doorway of the community hall that Christmas night, he didn't recognize the woman at the center of the room, not because Margaret had changed, but because for the first time in years, she was no longer diminished. 17 strangers sat around long folding tables, laughing, eating, raising glasses toward her as if she were the reason the season still meant something. And in many ways she was. The local paper had picked up the story that afternoon. Widowed grandmother feeds 17 forgotten souls on Christmas after being excluded by family, and it spread faster than Daniel could control. By the time he arrived, the damage to his carefully curated image was already done. Emily's name had surfaced in the comments first, then in the article update, neighbors had spoken, screenshots had been shared, and suddenly the truth was no longer private. The modern Christmas she insisted on had turned into an empty, overpriced performance dinner that their guests quietly left early, posting polite but telling remarks online about the cold atmosphere and forced smiles. Worse still, one of Daniel's key business clients had been among those guests, and by morning, the contract Daniel had spent months securing was gone, withdrawn with a single polite email citing a misalignment of values. Emily's event planning consultancy, built on image and reputation, collapsed within days as clients pulled out, unwilling to associate with someone publicly exposed for humiliating her own mother-in-law. But Margaret didn't watch any of it unfold on television or scroll through it on her phone. She was too busy pouring coffee, wrapping leftovers for the people who thanked her like she had given them more than just a meal. When Daniel finally approached her, his voice smaller than she had ever heard it, asking if they could talk, she didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse, didn't even look surprised. She simply handed him a neatly folded envelope. Inside was a notarized document transferring full ownership of the house he thought he controlled, legally secured months ago after his father's passing, something Margaret had quietly finalized while he and Emily were too busy redesigning her out of their lives. Alongside it was a second document, a withdrawal of all financial support she had been discreetly providing since his early career, the same support that had kept him afloat during his worst years. "You said my recipes didn't belong in your Christmas," she said calmly, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. "So I made sure I no longer belong in your life either." There was no anger in her voice, only clarity. Daniel stood there, holding the papers, finally understanding the cost of what he had allowed, what he had agreed to, what he had become. But Margaret had already turned away, returning to her table, where someone called her name with warmth and gratitude that needed no explanation. That night, she didn't just cook for 17 strangers. She chose them. And in doing so, she didn't lose a family. She replaced one that had already lost her. "Your old recipes don't fit the Christmas we're planning," my son said, and I remember noticing how casually he said it, like he was commenting on the weather instead of erasing 40 years of tradition from the table I built with my own hands. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask what he meant, not right away. I just stood there in his bright, modern kitchen, the one with the marble island I helped him pay for, and folded my hands together like I always do when I'm trying to understand something that doesn't make sense yet. Emily was beside him, leaning against the counter with that soft, practiced smile she wore whenever she wanted something to sound harmless. "We're just going for something more updated this year," she added, her voice light, almost cheerful, as if she were suggesting a new centerpiece instead of replacing me. I nodded slowly because that's what I've learned to do over the years: nod first, think later. "Of course," I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised even me. "Christmas should be exactly what you want it to be." Daniel looked relieved, like he'd been bracing for a reaction I didn't give him. That was always my role, after all, the one who made things easier, smoother, quieter. I turned back to the counter where I had already laid out the ingredients I'd brought with me that morning. Fresh sage, a stick of butter, a loaf of bread I baked before sunrise. The smell of it still lingered faintly in the air, warm and familiar, like something that didn't belong there anymore. I wrapped the loaf back up in the kitchen towel I carried it in and slid it gently into my bag. "I guess I won't need these," I said, more to myself than to them. Emily glanced at the bag, then quickly looked away. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, it's not like that," he said, but he didn't finish the sentence, and somehow that told me more than anything else he could have said. I gave him a small smile, the kind that keeps conversations from turning into conflicts. "It's fine," I replied. "Really?" And in that moment I meant it in a way he didn't understand yet. Because something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door closing in a room no one else noticed. I stayed for another 20 minutes, long enough to talk about grocery lists and guest counts. Long enough to hear Emily mention caterers and imported cheeses and a dessert menu that didn't include a single thing I had ever made. 17 guests, she said at one point, scrolling through her phone. 17. I remember that number because it stayed with me long after I walked out of their house and into the cold December air. The sky was already dimming, that early winter darkness settling in before 5 o'clock, and I stood by my car for a moment, holding onto the strap of my bag like it was anchoring me to something real. For years, Christmas had been measured in cups of flour and hours at the stove. In the quiet satisfaction of watching people I loved gather around a table that felt like home. And now suddenly I was standing outside of it, like a guest who hadn't been invited. I could have gone home. I could have unpacked the ingredients, put everything back where it belonged, and told myself it was just 1 year, just one change. But instead, I pulled my phone out of my coat pocket and opened a number I hadn't used in a while. It belonged to a small community shelter downtown, the kind of place that never turned anyone away, especially not on Christmas. My finger hovered over the screen for a second, just long enough for doubt to try and catch up with me. Then I pressed call. "Hi," I said when someone picked up, my voice steady, clear. "I was wondering how many people you're expecting for Christmas dinner this year." There was a pause on the other end, papers shuffling, a voice calling out numbers in the background. "About 17, the woman replied. I closed my eyes briefly, not in sadness, but in something that felt a lot like certainty. 17. The same number. I opened my eyes and looked out at the empty street in front of me, and for the first time since Daniel spoke, I felt something settle into place. "Good," I said softly. "Then I think I know exactly what I'm going to cook." The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the distance had not changed in over 20 years, and I found myself noticing small things I had not paid attention to before, like the way the streetlights flickered on one by one or how the bakery on the corner had already closed early for the holiday, its windows dark where there should have been warmth and movement. I parked in my driveway just as the last bit of daylight slipped away, leaving the house in that quiet, familiar stillness that used to feel comforting but now felt different, like it was waiting for something that was no longer coming. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it that morning, the kitchen clean, the counters bare, the faint scent of cinnamon still lingering from the loaf I had baked before sunrise. I set my bag down on the table and stood there for a moment, looking at the empty space where, in other years, there would have been lists, recipes, and half-prepared dishes waiting for me to continue. Christmas had always started early for me, days in advance, measured in grocery trips and careful planning, in handwritten notes tucked beside mixing bowls and timers set for things that could not be rushed. It was not just cooking. It was structure. It was purpose. And without it, the silence felt heavier than it should have. I slowly unpacked the ingredients I had taken with me, placing each one back in its proper place, not because I planned to use them right away, but because it felt important to restore some kind of order. The loaf of bread stayed wrapped in its towel a little longer than the rest. I ran my hand over the fabric, feeling the warmth that had already begun to fade, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember how Daniel used to wait by the oven as a boy, asking if it was ready, yet unable to hide his excitement for something as simple as fresh bread. That memory did not hurt the way I expected it to. It simply existed, separate from the man he had become, like a photograph from a different life. I placed the loaf gently on the counter and turned away. Instead of sitting down or turning on the television, I reached for a notepad and a pen, the same one I had used for years to plan every holiday meal. My handwriting was steady as I began to write line by line, dish by dish, not for Daniel or Emily, but for 17 people I had never met. Roast turkey, herb stuffing, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls, pie. I paused after each item, adjusting quantities in my mind, calculating portions the way I always had, only this time the faces around the table were unknown, undefined, and somehow that made the task feel lighter, not heavier. There were no expectations to meet, no traditions to defend, no subtle judgments hidden behind polite smiles. Just a number. 17. I checked my pantry, then the refrigerator, making a quiet inventory of what I already had and what I would need to buy. The process felt familiar, grounding, like stepping back into a role that had not been taken from me. only redirected. Later that evening, I called the shelter again to confirm the details, speaking with a woman named Carla who sounded surprised at first, then grateful in a way that was immediate and sincere. She told me they usually served simple meals, whatever they could prepare with limited resources, and when I explained what I planned to bring, there was a pause on the line before she said, "Are you sure?" I smiled even though she could not see it. "I have been doing this a long time," I replied. "I know how to cook for a full table." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my list in front of me, the house still quiet, but no longer empty in the same way. Outside, a light snow had started to fall, soft and steady, covering the street in a thin layer of white that reflected the glow of the streetlights. I watched it for a while, letting the stillness settle into something calmer, something clearer. Whatever Christmas was going to be, this year it was no longer something I was waiting to be invited into. It was something I was already preparing to create. The next morning began before the sun had fully risen, the kind of quiet hour where the world feels paused, and for the first time in a long while, I woke up with something clear in my mind instead of something missing. I tied my apron the same way I always had, the fabric worn soft over the years, and set a pot of coffee on the stove, letting the familiar routine settle into my hands before the day truly began. There was a steadiness in it, a rhythm that did not depend on anyone else's approval or invitation. I reviewed my list again not because I needed to, but because I wanted to make sure everything was just right. Cooking for 17 people required planning, precision, and a kind of quiet confidence that came from experience, not from being asked or expected, but from knowing exactly what needed to be done. By 8 o'clock I was already out the door, heading to the grocery store with my list folded neatly in my coat pocket. The parking lot was busier than usual, carts rattling across the pavement, people moving quickly with their own last-minute plans, but I walked in at my usual pace, steady and unhurried. I selected each ingredient carefully, inspecting produce the way I had always done, choosing fresh herbs, firm potatoes, and a turkey large enough to feed more than just a table, something closer to 18 pounds to make sure no one left hungry. As I moved through the aisles, I noticed how different it felt to shop without a specific face in mind, without trying to anticipate someone else's preferences or criticisms. There was no second-guessing, no hesitation, just decisions made with certainty. At the checkout, the young cashier smiled at me and asked if I was hosting a big family dinner. I paused for a brief second, then returned the smile. "Something like that," I said, and for once the answer felt completely honest. Back home, I laid everything out across the counter, organizing ingredients into groups the way I had done for decades, preparing not just food but time itself. The turkey went into the sink to thaw slightly under cool water, herbs were rinsed and set aside, and I began chopping vegetables with a precision that came from years of repetition. Each movement was quiet, deliberate, almost meditative. Hours passed without me noticing them in the usual way, measured instead by the progression of dishes coming together, by the scent of onions softening in butter, by the low hum of the oven warming the kitchen. Around midday my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it without stopping my hands. It was Daniel. The screen lit up with his name, followed by a short message asking if I could send over my old stuffing recipe because Emily's version was not turning out right. I read it once, then set the phone back down without responding. Not out of anger, but because for the first time it felt unnecessary. The recipe had never been just a list of ingredients. It had been time, patience, memory, and something they had already decided they no longer needed. I continued working, mixing, seasoning, tasting carefully, adjusting small details the way I always had, but this time there was no one watching, no one waiting to judge whether it met some invisible standard. By late afternoon the kitchen was full, not with people but with purpose. Containers were lined up across the counter, each one filled and sealed, ready to be transported. The turkey rested, golden and perfectly cooked, the kind of result that comes from years of doing something the same way because it works. I packed everything into insulated carriers, double-checking each item against my list, making sure nothing was forgotten. Before leaving, I paused at the doorway and looked back at the kitchen. It was not empty anymore. It had simply been waiting for the right reason to come alive again. I turned off the lights, picked up the carriers, and stepped out into the cold evening air, knowing exactly where I was going and why. The shelter was smaller than I expected, tucked between a closed laundromat and a narrow storefront with faded holiday decorations still taped to the glass, But the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the difference in the air, something warmer than the space itself, something that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with presence. A woman stood behind a folding table near the entrance, her sleeves rolled up, a clipboard in her hand, and when she looked up and saw the containers I was carrying, her expression shifted from polite attention to something closer to disbelief. "Margaret?" she asked, stepping forward quickly, her voice lifting slightly as if she had not quite expected me to be real. "Yes," I replied, setting the first carrier down carefully, then the second, the weight of them settling onto the table with a soft, solid sound. "I hope I am not too early." She shook her head immediately, already reaching for the lids, her movements quick but careful. "No, not at all. We just started setting up. I am Carla." I nodded, recognizing the voice from the phone call the night before, and for a moment, we simply stood there as she lifted one lid after another, releasing the scent of roasted turkey, herbs, and warm bread into the room. It filled the space almost instantly, drawing quiet attention from people seated along the far wall, their conversations slowing, their eyes shifting toward the table without anyone saying a word. "You made all of this?" Carla asked, her voice softer now, as if she did not want to break something fragile. "I did," I answered, not with pride but with certainty. She exhaled slowly, then smiled in a way that felt unpracticed, genuine in a way I had not seen in a long time. "They are going to remember this," she said, and I understood she was not just talking about the meal. We began setting everything out together, arranging dishes across long folding tables that had been covered with simple paper cloths. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress, just enough to create a place where people could sit without feeling like they had to leave too quickly. As we worked, a few of the guests approached cautiously at first, offering to help, asking quiet questions, their voices carrying a kind of careful politeness that comes from not wanting to take up too much space. I handed one man a stack of plates, and he thanked me twice, holding them as if they were more valuable than they were. Another woman asked if she could help slice the bread, and when I nodded, she smiled with a kind of relief that stayed with me longer than her words. By the time everything was ready, the room had changed. It was still small, still modest, but it no longer felt temporary or overlooked. It felt like something had been built there, something that did not rely on appearances or expectations. When people finally sat down, there was no announcement, no formal beginning, just the quiet understanding that it was time. I moved between the tables, making sure everyone had what they needed, adjusting small details without drawing attention to them, the way I had done for years. But this time there was no tension beneath it, no sense that I was performing a role that could be taken away. Each thank you was direct, unfiltered, not wrapped in obligation or habit. At one point I noticed someone had taken a photo, just a simple picture of the table, the food, the people gathered together, and I did not think much of it then. I only knew that for the first time in a long while, I was not thinking about what I had lost, or what I had been told no longer fit. I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I had always known how to do, and nothing about it felt outdated. The sound of quiet conversation filled the room in a way that felt natural, not forced, rising and falling like something alive rather than something arranged, and I found myself slowing down just enough to take it in, to notice the details I used to miss when I was too focused on making everything perfect. A man near the end of the table laughed softly as he told a story I could not fully hear. His hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as if it grounded him, while across from him a young woman carefully folded her napkin after every few bites, as though she had not been taught that she was allowed to relax. No one rushed. No one checked the time. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if the meal itself deserved to be experienced instead of simply finished. Carla moved beside me, refilling water glasses, her earlier urgency replaced by a quiet ease that matched the rest of the room. "This is different," she said under her breath, not looking at me directly but at the tables, at the people who were no longer sitting apart from each other but leaning in, sharing small pieces of themselves between bites. I nodded, though I did not feel the need to explain why. Some things do not require explanation when they are felt clearly enough. A man approached me after he had finished eating, holding his empty plate carefully, as if he was not quite sure where to put it. He looked at me for a moment before speaking, his expression steady but thoughtful. "I cannot remember the last time a meal tasted like this," he said, not with exaggeration, but with a kind of quiet certainty that made the words land differently. I smiled slightly and took the plate from him. "I am glad you enjoyed it," I replied, because anything more would have felt unnecessary. He hesitated for a second longer, then added, "It feels like someone remembered what it is supposed to be." I did not ask him what he meant. I did not need to. Later, as the room began to settle into a softer rhythm, I noticed the same young woman who had been folding her napkin standing near the table where the desserts were set out, her eyes moving slowly across the choices as if she was deciding whether she should take something at all. I stepped beside her without drawing attention and handed her a plate. "You should try the pie," I said gently. "It turned out well." She looked at me, surprised at first, then nodded, taking the plate with both hands as if it mattered more than it should have. "Thank you," she said quietly, and this time the gratitude was not just for the food. As the evening continued, I found myself sitting down for the first time, not because I was finished, but because there was nothing left to fix or adjust. Everything was as it needed to be. I folded my hands in my lap and looked around the room, noticing how the light reflected off the simple decorations, how the conversations overlapped without competing, how no one seemed to be waiting for something else to begin. This was it. This was the moment. And it was enough. My phone vibrated softly in my coat pocket, the sound almost out of place in the quiet comfort of the room. I did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I let it buzz once, then again, before finally taking it out and glancing at the screen. Several missed calls. A few messages. Daniel's name repeated more than once. I looked at it for a brief moment, then turned the screen off and placed the phone back into my pocket without opening anything. Not out of avoidance, but because whatever was happening there no longer required my immediate attention. For the first time in a long time, I was not being pulled away from something meaningful. I was already in the middle of it, and I chose to stay. By the time the last plate had been cleared and the conversations began to quiet into something softer, something more reflective, the room felt different again, not because it was emptying, but because it had settled into a kind of calm that only comes after something meaningful has taken place. I stood near the end of the table, stacking dishes slowly, not in a hurry to leave, not in a rush to move on to whatever came next. Carla approached me with a folded piece of paper in her hand, her expression thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Someone wrote this," she said, offering it to me carefully, as if it carried more weight than it should. I unfolded it without speaking, my eyes moving across the simple handwriting that filled the page. It was not long, just a few sentences, but each one was deliberate. "Thank you for making tonight feel like a real holiday. Thank you for remembering us." I read it once, then again, not because I needed to, but because the words settled somewhere deeper than I expected. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my coat pocket without comment. Carla watched me for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if she understood that some things do not need to be said out loud. Outside, the cold had deepened, the air sharper than it had been earlier, and as I carried the empty containers back to my car, I noticed how quiet the street was, the kind of quiet that comes when most people have already found their place for the evening. I set everything into the trunk, closed it gently, and stood there for a moment, looking up at the sky where the clouds had cleared just enough to reveal a few scattered stars. It had been years since I had paid attention to something as simple as that. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, more insistent this time, and I finally took it out, not out of urgency but because I knew it was time to see what had been waiting. The screen lit up with a series of messages, Daniel's name appearing over and over, each one more urgent than the last. "Where are you, Mom? Please call me. Something went wrong." I opened the most recent message and read it slowly, not reacting immediately, just taking in the words for what they were. There was no anger in them, no accusation, just a kind of confusion that felt unfamiliar coming from him. I scrolled further down, noticing a photo attached to one of the messages. I hesitated for a brief second before opening it. The image showed their dining table, perfectly set, every detail arranged with precision, but the room itself felt strangely empty, not in the physical sense, but in a way that was harder to define. The plates were full, the decorations elaborate, but no one was looking at each other. Several chairs were pushed back slightly, as if people had already started to leave. In the background, Emily stood near the kitchen, her posture rigid, her expression tight in a way I had not seen before. It was a moment captured without intention, but it revealed more than it should have. I studied it quietly, then closed the image and locked my phone without replying. Not because I did not care, but because for the first time, I understood that their situation was something they would have to face without me stepping in to smooth it over. I got into my car, the interior still holding a faint warmth from earlier, and started the engine, letting it idle for a moment before pulling away. As I drove home, the streets seemed calmer, the holiday lights reflecting softly off the pavement, and I realized that nothing about this night had gone the way it was expected to. Not for them and not for me. But as I turned into my driveway and stepped out into the quiet, I did not feel like something had been taken from me. If anything, something had been returned, something I had not realized I had been giving away for years. And now that it was back, I had no intention of letting it go again. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, but it was not the kind of silence that presses against you or reminds you of what is missing. It was steady, almost deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me to return without needing to ask where I had been. I set my keys down on the small table by the door and took off my coat slowly, folding it over my arm instead of tossing it aside the way I used to when I came home tired from long days in the kitchen. Tonight I was not tired in that way. There was a different kind of weight in me, something settled, something clear. I moved into the kitchen and turned on the light, letting the familiar space come into view piece by piece, the counters, the stove, the neatly arranged jars that had not changed in years. For a moment I simply stood there, looking at it, understanding something I had not fully allowed myself to see before. This place had never stopped belonging to me. I had just stepped away from it, little by little, until it felt like I needed permission to return. My phone buzzed again on the table behind me, the sound sharper in the stillness of the room, and this time I did not ignore it. I walked back, picked it up, and opened the most recent message without hesitation. It was longer than the others. Mom, please call me. The dinner fell apart. People left early. I do not know what happened. Emily is upset. We needed your help. I read it once, then again, not because I was unsure of the words, but because of what they revealed without meaning to. We needed your help. Not your presence. Not your place at the table. Your help. I let the phone rest in my hand for a moment, feeling the quiet weight of it. Then I set it down again without responding. I walked back into the kitchen and reached for a glass, filling it with water, taking a slow sip as I leaned against the counter. For years I had been the one who stepped in before things fell apart, the one who adjusted, corrected, smoothed over every detail so that no one else had to notice what was missing. I had believed that was what held everything together. But tonight had shown me something different. It had not been the recipes. It had not been the timing or the presentation. It had been the intention behind it, something that could not be replaced by something newer or more impressive. I set the glass down and walked toward the small drawer where I kept old papers, receipts, things I had not sorted through in a long time. I pulled it open and looked inside, not searching for anything specific at first, just letting my hand move through what had been set aside over the years. Then I found it, a folder I had placed there after my husband passed, one I had not opened since. I took it out carefully and set it on the table, opening it slowly, page by page, until I reached the documents I had once read with more emotion than clarity. Ownership records, financial statements, legal confirmations that had been handled quietly, finalized without discussion, because at the time, I had trusted that things would remain as they had always been. I read through them again now, not with doubt, but with a different understanding. The house, the accounts, the decisions, they had never been handed over. They had remained exactly where they were meant to be. With me. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it for a moment, feeling a sense of control return in a way that was not loud or dramatic, but undeniable. My phone buzzed once more, another message appearing on the screen, but this time I did not feel the pull to respond at all. Instead, I turned off the light in the kitchen and carried the folder with me as I walked toward the living room, the quiet of the house no longer something I had to fill, but something I had chosen. And for the first time in a very long time, that choice felt entirely mine. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of slow, steady light that does not demand anything from you, and I woke up without the familiar list of obligations running through my mind, without the quiet pressure to prepare, adjust, or anticipate someone else's expectations. For the first time in years, there was nothing waiting for me that required me to prove my place in someone else's plans. I moved through the house at my own pace, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the soft winter light settle into the rooms that had once felt too large and too quiet. Now, they simply felt like mine. The folder I had carried with me the night before sat on the table exactly where I had left it, a quiet reminder of something I had always had but never fully claimed. I sat down and opened it again, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because I wanted to understand it differently this time, without the assumptions I had held on to before. Each document was clear, precise, written in language that left no room for interpretation. Ownership, authority, control. Words that had once felt distant now felt immediate, grounded, real. I traced my finger along the lines, not out of hesitation, but as if I was acknowledging something that had been waiting for me to recognize it. My phone lay beside the folder, silent now, the urgency from the night before replaced by stillness. I did not check it right away. Instead, I closed the folder and stood up, walking back into the kitchen where the faint scent of yesterday's cooking still lingered, softer now but present. I filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove, listening to the quiet click as the burner came to life. It was a small sound, but it grounded me in the present in a way that felt intentional. When I finally picked up my phone, there were no new messages, only the ones from the night before, still waiting, still unanswered. I opened the conversation and read through them again, slower this time, not searching for meaning, but observing what had been said and what had not. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done, only confusion, inconvenience, and the expectation that I would step back into the role I had quietly stepped out of. I locked the screen and set the phone down without responding. Outside, the snow had settled overnight, covering the street in a smooth, uninterrupted layer that reflected the pale morning light. It looked untouched, as if nothing had passed through it yet, as if the day had not decided what it would become. I watched it for a moment, then turned away, already knowing what I needed to do next. I reached for my coat, the same one I had worn the night before, and slipped it on with steady hands. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. This was not about reacting to what had happened. It was about deciding what would happen next. I picked up the folder and placed it carefully into my bag along with my keys and my phone, then paused briefly at the door, not because I was unsure, but because I was aware that something had shifted in a way that would not return to what it had been before. When I stepped outside, the cold air met me sharply, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt clear. I walked to my car and started the engine, letting it warm for a moment before pulling out of the driveway, the tires pressing fresh tracks into the untouched snow. There was a quiet sense of direction in me now, not driven by obligation or expectation, but by something far more certain. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit into spaces that were slowly being reshaped without me. Now I was no longer adjusting. I was choosing. And whatever came next would not be something I waited to be included in. It would be something I stepped into on my own terms. The office building stood exactly as I remembered it, tall, structured, and quietly imposing in a way that did not need to announce its importance. And as I walked through the front doors, I felt a familiar sense of clarity settle into place, the same kind I used to feel when I handled matters that required precision instead of emotion. The receptionist greeted me politely, her voice calm, professional, and I gave my name without hesitation, watching as recognition flickered briefly across her face before she nodded and picked up the phone. It had been a while since I had been here, but some things do not fade as easily as people assume. When I was led into the office, the man who stood to greet me did so with the same steady presence I remembered, his expression respectful, not surprised, as if my return had always been a possibility he accounted for. "Margaret," he said, extending his hand. "It has been some time." I nodded, taking the seat across from him, placing my bag carefully on the floor beside me before setting the folder on the desk. "It has," I replied simply, because anything more would have shifted the focus away from why I was there. He glanced at the folder, then back at me, waiting, not rushing, understanding that some conversations require space to begin properly. I opened it and turned it toward him, my hand resting lightly on the pages as if anchoring them in place. "I would like everything reviewed," I said, my voice even measured. "All ownership records, financial access, and any existing authorizations." He did not ask why. He did not question the timing. He simply nodded and began to go through the documents one by one, his attention focused, his movements precise. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper shifting, the occasional note being written, the kind of quiet that allows decisions to form without interference. After several minutes, he looked up, his expression unchanged but more defined, as if the information had settled into something clear. "Everything is in your name," he said. "Always has been. There are secondary access permissions listed, but they are revocable at any time." I met his gaze without hesitation. "I want them revoked," I said. The words did not feel heavy. They felt correct. He nodded once, making a note, then continued. "There are also financial transfers that have been occurring regularly from your accounts," he added, sliding a page slightly forward. "Support payments. Those can be discontinued as well." I looked at the numbers briefly, not with surprise, but with recognition of something I had allowed to continue without question for far too long. "Stop them," I replied. Again, no hesitation. He made another note, his pen moving steadily across the page. "And the property?" he asked. I placed my hand flat on the document, feeling the weight of it not as a burden, but as confirmation. "Remains unchanged," I said. "No transfers. No shared claims." He nodded again, closing the folder with a quiet finality that echoed the decision itself. "I will have everything processed by the end of the day," he said. I stood up slowly, gathering my things, not because I was in a hurry, but because there was nothing left to reconsider. As I walked toward the door, he added, "If there is anything further you need." I paused briefly, then shook my head. "There is not," I said, and this time I knew it completely. Outside, the air was colder than it had been earlier, but it felt sharp in a way that cleared rather than weighed down, and as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I realized that what I had done inside that office was not reactive, not emotional, but deliberate. For years, I had given access, support, and control without ever questioning whether it would be respected. Now that question had been answered, and so had my response. By the time I returned home that afternoon, there was a stillness in the air that felt earned rather than empty, the kind that comes after a decision has been made and set into motion without the need to revisit it. I placed my bag down on the table and removed my coat slowly, my movements steady, not out of fatigue, but out of awareness that something had shifted in a way that would not reverse itself. The phone began ringing before I even reached the kitchen, sharp and immediate, breaking through the quiet with a persistence that made its purpose clear. I looked at it for a moment as it rang, Daniel's name filling the screen again, but this time there was no hesitation in my response. I answered. "Mom." His voice came through quickly, uneven in a way I had never heard from him before. Not angry, not controlled, just unsettled. "What is going on?" "The bank called me. I cannot access anything. The transfer stopped. I tried to cover a payment this morning and it did not go through." I walked to the counter and set my hand against it, grounding myself in the moment before I spoke. "That is correct," I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough for the weight of what I said to settle in. "What do you mean that is correct?" he asked, his voice tightening slightly, confusion beginning to shift into something sharper. "I mean that the access you had has been removed," I replied, keeping my tone even, not raised, not defensive. "And the financial support you were receiving has been discontinued." Another pause, this one longer, heavier, filled with the sound of him trying to understand something he had never considered could change. "You cannot just do that," he said finally, the words coming out more as disbelief than accusation. I let a small breath pass before answering. "It was always mine to do," I said. There was movement on his end, muffled voices in the background, and then Emily's voice, sharper, more controlled, cutting through the line. "Margaret, this is not appropriate," she said, her tone measured but firm, as if she was correcting something minor. "We are in the middle of important financial commitments. You cannot make changes like this without discussing it with us." I listened without interrupting, the words landing exactly where they were meant to, revealing more than they intended. "There is nothing to discuss," I replied, my voice steady, unyielding in a way that did not need to be loud. "The arrangements have been reviewed and corrected." "Corrected," Emily repeated, and for the first time there was a crack in her composure. There was nothing incorrect. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding, not out of hesitation, but because some things need space to be understood. "You said my place did not fit into your plans," I said quietly. So I adjusted mine. The line went silent again, not empty, but full of something that had no immediate response. Daniel spoke next, his voice lower now, stripped of the certainty he usually carried. "This is about dinner?" he asked, as if reducing it would make it manageable. I shook my head slightly even though he could not see it. "No," I said. "This is about understanding what belongs where." There were no raised voices, no argument, just a quiet realization beginning to take shape on the other end of the line. I did not wait for them to find the right words. I did not offer explanations beyond what was necessary. "Take care of what is yours," I said finally before ending the call. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was complete. And for the first time it felt like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The house remained quiet after the call, but it was no longer the kind of silence that followed conflict or confusion. It was settled, defined, as if something had finally been placed exactly where it belonged after years of being slightly out of position. I moved through the living room slowly, not pacing, not restless, just aware of the space in a way I had not allowed myself to be before. The afternoon light stretched across the floor in long, soft lines, touching the edges of furniture that had held more history than anyone had bothered to acknowledge lately. My phone stayed on. The table, still, no longer demanding attention, no longer carrying urgency that needed to be answered. Hours passed without interruption, and I used that time not to think about what had happened, but to continue what I had already started. I opened drawers I had not sorted in years, organized papers, cleared out what no longer served a purpose, and set aside what still held value, not just financially but personally. There was something deliberate in every movement, something that felt less like cleaning and more like reclaiming. By early evening, the first knock came at the door, firm but not aggressive, the kind that expected to be answered. I did not rush to it. I finished what I was doing, placed the last document into its proper folder, and then walked toward the door with steady steps. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, his posture different from what I had seen before, less certain, less composed, as if the distance between us had finally become something he could feel instead of ignore. Emily stood slightly behind him, her expression controlled, but there was a tension in it now that had not been there before, something tighter, something less certain of its own authority. "We need to talk," Daniel said, his voice quieter than usual, not demanding but not entirely asking either. I looked at him for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing them in without comment. They walked into the house carefully, as if they were entering a place they no longer fully understood, their eyes moving briefly across the room before settling back on me. I closed the door behind them and turned, not positioning myself between them and anything, not guarding anything, simply standing where I chose to stand. "What you did today," Emily began, her tone measured, but there was an edge beneath it, something trying to regain control that had already been lost, was disruptive. There are financial obligations, agreements, expectations that you cannot just remove without consequence. I listened without interrupting, my expression unchanged, my posture steady. When she finished, I did not respond immediately. I let the silence settle, not as a tactic, but because there was no need to fill it too quickly. "Those arrangements were never yours to rely on," I said finally, my voice calm, clear. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his hands tightening at his sides. "Mom, we did not know," he said, and there was something honest in that, something unguarded. "You never said anything." I met his gaze without hesitation. "You never asked," I replied. The words did not land harshly. They simply existed, undeniable in their truth. Emily shifted slightly, her composure tightening again. "Regardless, this affects more than just you," she said. "There are reputations, commitments, people involved." I held her gaze this time, not confrontational, but steady in a way that did not allow her words to redirect the conversation. "Then you should have considered that before deciding what I was worth including," I said. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different. Not uncertain. Not tense. Final. Daniel looked around the house briefly, as if seeing it for the first time, as if understanding something that had always been there but never acknowledged. "So that is it?" he asked quietly. I did not move. I did not soften. "That is what it has always been," I said. And in that moment there was nothing left for them to argue, nothing left to negotiate, because what had changed was not the situation. It was the clarity around it. And clarity does not leave room for misunderstanding once it has been fully seen. Daniel stood there longer than he should have, as if waiting for something to shift back into place, as if the version of me he was used to would eventually step forward and soften what had already been decided. But nothing moved, nothing changed, and after a moment, he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but heavy with something he could no longer avoid. Emily was the first to break the stillness, her voice sharper now, less controlled, as if the structure she had built around herself had started to crack under the weight of what she could not manage. "Do you even understand what you have done?" she asked, and this time there was no attempt to soften it, no careful tone, just frustration exposed in a way that revealed more than she intended. I did not react to the sharpness in her voice. I had heard versions of it before, hidden beneath politeness, dressed in better words. Now it was simply clearer. "Yes," I said calmly, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to unsettle her more than anything else could have. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the room before stopping, his movements restless, uncertain. "We had people there last night," he said, his voice lower now, strained in a way that told me more than the words themselves. "Important people. Clients. Friends. They saw everything fall apart. They saw—" He stopped, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. Emily picked up where he could not, her voice tight. "They saw that we could not even host a proper dinner," she said. "Do you know what that does to our reputation?" I looked at her for a moment, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet recognition. "Yes," I replied. "I do." There was a pause, brief but significant, because this time they both understood that I was not speaking from assumption. I had seen the photo. I had read the messages. I had understood what had happened without needing to be there. Daniel's voice came again, softer, almost unsteady. "One of my partners pulled out this morning," he admitted. He said it reflected poorly on how we manage things. That if we cannot handle something as simple as a gathering, he cannot trust larger commitments. The words settled into the room without resistance. They did not need emphasis. Emily's expression tightened further, her composure slipping in small visible ways. "And my clients," she added, her voice quieter now, less certain. "They have been calling, asking questions, canceling meetings." She looked at me then directly, as if trying to find something to hold on to, something that would shift the outcome back in her favor. "This did not have to happen," she said. I held her gaze steadily, not stepping forward, not stepping back. "It already did," I replied. There was no anger in my voice, no satisfaction, just finality. Daniel looked down for a moment, then back up, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not confusion, not defensiveness, understanding, slow, difficult, but undeniable. "We pushed you out," he said quietly, the words coming with effort but without resistance. I did not respond immediately. I let him sit with it, let the truth settle fully without interruption. "Yes," I said after a moment. "Nothing more." Emily looked between us, her expression shifting, searching for something that would redirect the moment, but there was nothing left to redirect. Everything had already been said. Daniel nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried more weight than anything he had said before. "And now we are on our own," he added, not as a question but as a realization. I did not correct him. I did not soften it. "You always were," I said. The room fell quiet again, but this time there was no tension in it, no uncertainty, just clarity. Emily turned slightly, her posture no longer rigid, but unsettled, as if the foundation she had relied on had shifted beneath her without warning. Daniel stepped back toward the door, his movements slower now, more deliberate. "We will figure it out," he said, though it sounded less like a statement and more like something he needed to believe. I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. "You will have to," I replied. He paused at the door, his hand resting briefly on the handle before he looked back at me one last time. "I did not understand what you were holding together," he said. I met his gaze, steady and unchanged. "You were not supposed to," I answered. "You were supposed to value it." He nodded again, then opened the door and stepped out into the cold, Emily following close behind, her silence now complete. I closed the door gently after them, not with force, not with finality that needed to be demonstrated, but with the quiet certainty that nothing about this moment required emphasis. The house returned to stillness, but it was no longer something that needed to be filled or fixed. It was whole exactly as it was. I walked back into the kitchen, resting my hand lightly on the counter, feeling the space in a way that no longer carried expectation or obligation. Everything that belonged to me was still here. The house, the decisions, the control. And for the first time, I was not sharing it with people who only noticed it when it was gone. I turned off the light and stepped away, knowing that what had ended was not my place in something. It was their access to it. And that difference was everything.